To fetch data, we're going to need a few things. So open your terminal and npm install SWR, axios, use debounce, which is a React custom hook to debounce variables and callbacks. And finally, React hot toast to display messages using toasts. Once everything is installed, go back to your terminal and create a new file under the hooks folder and call it use_infinite_query. We'll use this file to create a new custom React hooks to fetch multiple pages of data from our API to render them later with an infinite loading list component. For that, we need to import use SWR infinite from SWR. This is a custom hook from the SWR package that gives us the ability to trigger multiple requests with only one hook. Next, export a function as default and call it use_infinite_query. This is our custom React hook. This hook accepts a query key and an initial data parameters. Now you can call the use SWR infinite hook we just imported and pass a function that accepts the index and the previous page data. We will use this function to give use SWR infinite the key of the page to retrieve, or in other words, the URL to use to fetch the page data. So let's first handle the case where we reach the end of the data. If there is some previous data but no after cursor provided, we know for sure that we don't have anything else to fetch. In this case, we just return null, which tells SWR that there is nothing to fetch. Now, let's generate the query key for the first page of data. This one is pretty straightforward. If the page index is equal to 0, you can simply return the query key as it is from the parameters. Now, for all the next pages, we need to include the cursor to the query key. If you remember, the cursor is what FaunaDB uses to paginate data. So we need to pass the cursor to the API endpoint to fetch the right page. First, check if there is any search term in the query key provided from the arguments. Then use string interpolation to concatenate the query key, which is actually the base URL of the API endpoint, with the page cursor. Alright, so let's recap what is going on here. So we get the cursor from the previous page data, then we stringify it because the cursor provided by FaunaDB can be an object, and we wrap everything inside the encode URI component function to make sure our string is encoded properly to be passed in the URL. Finally, we pass the result as a query string to the query key, and we use the search variable to make sure we use the right character to concatenate the cursor to the base URL. So now that we have the function to build the query key for the use SWR infinite hook, we need to pass the fetcher it should use to fetch our data. Let's actually define it inside our utils.js file. So open this file and export a new function named fetcher, pass the URL to it, and use axios to get the resource from the URL. Then return the response data once received from the server. And obviously, don't forget to import axios at the top of your file. That's it for this function. It is pretty straightforward. It just performs a GET request to the API endpoint provided as an argument and returns the data provided by the server. Now go back to your use_infinite_query.js file and import the fetcher function at the top. Next, pass the initial data argument as the third parameter to the use SWR infinite hook. This data will be used by SWR as the initial value. That's great because you can prefetch data on the server with Next.js, initialize SWR with it, and then keep fetching more data if needed on the client side. Alright, now we get the values returned by this hook. So we have the data retrieved, the error thrown by the fetcher or undefined otherwise, the page size, and the page size setter, like a React state. To make things easier for the component that will use our React hook, let's create a function named fetchNextPage and use the page size setter to increment the size by 1. So every time we need to fetch a new page, we can simply call this function without worrying about the internal mechanism of this hook. Next, let's flatten the pages. The use SWR infinite hook returns all the data fetched so far as an individual array for each page. But we don't care about that as we'll render everything as an infinite loading list. So use the flapMap method and return each page data or an empty array otherwise. Then create a new variable as a boolean to check if we have reached the end of our data. Then create a boolean to check if we are fetching the first page data, and create another one to check if we are fetching any page data, including the first one. Finally, return the data using the flattened pages variable, the error, and all the variables we just defined. Alright, now our React component is done, so let's use it. Create a new React component named infinite data list that accepts a query key and an initial data props. Then call the use infinite query hook we just created with the query key and the initial data. Using object destructuring, retrieve all the values returned by this hook. Next, check if you have an error while fetching data. If yes, notify the user with a toast and a friendly error message. Then, if we don't get any error, and if we are done fetching the first page, but we don't have any data, render a simple message on the screen using an icon from error icons and a span element, and add a few Tailwind CSS classes to style this error message. Otherwise, if we have data to render, loop over it using the map method inside JSX and render a card component for each item. If we are fetching any data, render a few card skeleton components, which will act as a loading indicator to show the user we are fetching the data they requested. And don't forget to import this component at the top. The card skeleton is a component I have already built. You can find the source code in the description below. But as you can see, this is a very simple component that renders a bunch of JSX that looks like a placeholder card animated using the animatePulse utility class from Tailwind CSS. Alright, let's go back to our infinite data list component. Now, let's check if we have reached the end of our data. If not, render a div element with a ref we will create after we are done here. Otherwise, render some text to let the user know that he has reached the end of the list. In other words, we don't have any more data to fetch. Next, create the ref using the React useRef hook at the top of your component. We'll use this ref to detect when the user is scrolling down and has reached the div element with that ref. So import useRef and useEffect at the top. Then create a side effect with the useEffect hook and add an event listener to listen to the scroll event. Passing a load more event handler that we'll create just after. Next, return the cleanup function from that side effect to remove the event listener. Alright, now let's create the load more function. Check if the DOM element from the ref object is in the viewport, meaning that the user has scrolled down to the end of the list. In that case, we fetch the next page data. So import the isInViewport function from the utils.js function. This is a function I've built before, so grab it from the source code in the description below. Next, import the useDebounce callback hook from useDebounce. We'll use this hook to debounce our loadMore function so we don't call it for each scrolling event we receive, which will otherwise be very inefficient. So wrap the loadMore function around the useDebounce callback hook and pass it 500, which is the delay in milliseconds before this function is invoked. Okay, now there is still one more thing we need to do before using our component. In line 37, we have used the toast function from React.toast to display an error message. But we haven't specified where to render the toast in our application. So open app.js file and import toaster from React.toast. Then add the toaster component to your app. This component will render all received toast in our application when we call the toast function. Alright, now let's use our infinite data list component. Open the index.js file from the post folder. Replace the loop and the card components with the infinite data list component. specify the query key prop as /API/props, and pass the initial data prop as well. Let's actually rename the data prop of our post component to initial data so we are consistent across our application. Alright, now save your files and then refresh your browser. Now, as you may have noticed, we can see the skeletons while the application is fetching the first page data. Then, if we scroll down, we briefly see the skeleton again down below while fetching the next page data. Finally, when we reach the end of the list, we get a message telling us that there is no more data as expected, which is great. Alright, now that we have built the page to render all the blog posts using an infinite loading list, we can do the same thing to create another page under the post folder inside a .me.js file to only render the blog post from the authenticated user. To save some time, I've already built this page as it is very similar to the one we built together. So let's just review it here. As you can see, this React component is rendering the page using the infinite data list component we have created together. The API endpoint or the query key we provide to this component is using the user email address if he is authenticated. Otherwise, we just use the base URL for fetching all blog posts. This case is not very important though, as we'll see later how to protect this page and redirect the user to the sign-in page if he's not authenticated. Down below, we export the getStaticProps method where we fetch the initial data to pre-render the page at build time with the first few blog posts from the current authenticated user. Of course, I've also built the same page for the draft or unpublished blog post of the current user. If we look at the me.js file inside the draft folder, you can see that this component is very similar to the one we just saw, except that the query key is slightly different as we want to fetch the draft only. So now if we run our application again, you can see we have a new page at /post/me, which only render my own blog posts using an infinite loading list. And we have the same thing for the draft at the /draft/me URL.